How you doing, everybody? I'm Ken Bykoff, and welcome to O'Neill Speaks, the official podcast of the Paul H. O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University. In an effort to combat climate change, a move away from fossil fuels, particularly when it comes to how we get around, is seen as one of the critical steps to making progress. Electric vehicles, or EVs, are seen as the next step in the evolution away from fossil fuels. The idea of an electric vehicle isn't new. The idea is nearly 200 years old, and the first mass-produced EVs were built in the early 1900s. But only in the past 2 decades has the effort to transition from gas to electric vehicles gathered momentum. And the effort has come with hurdles. Battery capacity can limit range, and there are environmental concerns to be addressed, and simply getting people to accept a different model of vehicle is a challenge. Recently, President Joe Biden and the Environmental Protection Agency finalized regulations that have created the United States' toughest limits on passenger car and light truck emissions ever. The regulations are designed to accelerate the transition to EVs, even if automakers won't need to dramatically boost EV sales until after 2030. Meanwhile, Emissions Analytics, a United Kingdom-based company that compiles large databases of independent test data to give market insights and deliver unbiased test results on real-world product performance, recently released a report showing that, due to the weight of EVs, tire wear emissions are 1,850 times greater than tailpipe particulate emissions from gas cars. In other words, EVs may have lower particulate emissions when it comes to fuel emissions, but it could have a larger impact in other ways. Finding a way to balance the pros with the cons and, more importantly, convincing reluctant consumers to make the transition to EVs is part of the challenge of adopting a different technology that is so embedded in our culture. We're joined today by Professor John Graham, who has long been focused on risk analysis. He is the former administrator of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs in the Federal Office of Management and Budget during the George W. Bush administration. Professor Graham also served as Dean of the O'Neill School from 2008 to 2019, and he has remained a faculty member with a keen interest in electric vehicles. John, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Ken. Good to be here.
Well, first off, what are your thoughts on the feasibility of the latest EPA regulations, which the EPA says will prevent 7.2 billion metric tons of carbon emissions from entering the atmosphere through 2055, while also reducing fine particulate matter and nitrogen oxides, preventing up to 2,500 premature deaths from air pollution annually starting in 2055?
Well, Ken, the basic direction of the regulation is sensible. We do need to reduce greenhouse gases and clean our environment. The specifics of the regulation call for, by the model year 2032, more than 50% of new cars are likely to have to be all electric vehicles. That's going to be a very difficult mark to meet. So feasibility is still in question.
I also want to get your thoughts on the emissions analytics study that suggests tire particulate emissions are a somewhat overlooked part of the equation when it comes to EVs.
Yes, when you put a big battery pack in an electric car, to give it the long range on a single charge, it makes the vehicle heavier. Anywhere from several hundred to 1,000 pounds heavier than a gasoline-powered car, even when you account for taking out the gasoline engine. So yes, you're going to have more tire wear, and you're going to have more wear on the roads and the highways when you have electric cars on the road. The good news is that the vehicle manufacturers are looking a way to use more lightweight materials to compensate some for this. And the states are developing new alternatives to raise funding for road repairs, since the gasoline tax isn't going to do the job in the future with electric cars.
So is there a certain balance between getting consumers to adapt to a technology that promises to be better in the long term, even if there are short-term challenges with the technology? I mean, for instance, undoubtedly batteries will get stronger and smaller, and cars will get lighter in the future. But for the time being, weight and range continue to be an issue with EVs.
Yes, like all technological innovations, there's a transition period. And I think one of the key issues right now is how to make sure that we also encourage transition technologies, like conventional hybrid vehicles, such as the Toyota Prius, and the plug-in hybrid vehicles, such as the Mitsubishi Outlander, which is one of the highest selling plug-in hybrid vehicles in the world. That hybrid technology, what it does is that you do have a gasoline engine as a backup. So if you can't find a charging station, you can still get powered with your backup gasoline engine.
Are companies getting too ahead with focusing so much attention on EVs when maybe they should spend a little bit more time with those transition vehicles? I know that Prius has been out, hybrids have been out for a long time, but are they trying to make the curve, I guess, a little bit steeper for adoption than people want it to be?
Yes, I think a lot of people saw the early success of Tesla, and then the rest of the manufacturers got really scared. They thought, hey, oh wow, Tesla might just take over the whole market with these all-electric vehicles. But now it's becoming increasingly clear that not all consumers are going to be willing to go with a Tesla-type vehicle. And they need a learning process to bring people into electrification, and hybrids and plug-in hybrids are a sensible strategy to do that. The problem is EPA's regulations are not encouraging the hybrids. They're actually discouraging them, and that's a problem.
Are there the same sorts of weight problems with hybrids that you see with EVs?
There are much smaller weight problems because the battery pack in a hybrid vehicle or in a plug-in hybrid vehicle is really small compared to the battery in an all-electric vehicle. And to give you some sense of that, the battery capacity in an all-electric vehicle like a Tesla, if we were to take that battery capacity and use it for conventional hybrids, we could probably get 20 conventional hybrids on the road for every one Tesla all-electric vehicle. And that's, of course, why Toyota is putting out a big push to put these hybrids out in the market, and they're selling extremely well, better than all-electric vehicles in many parts of the United States.
Well, another question is, do we even have the infrastructure to support the all-electric vehicles now? Because I know that there are charging stations in a lot of different places, but they aren't necessarily ubiquitous.
Yes, good question, Ken. So what's happening right now is a lot of the investments in charging stations are going into states like California that have adopted state zero-emission vehicle requirements. So if you're a vehicle manufacturer, you're selling cars on the West Coast or the East Coast, you have to sell an increasing number of zero-emission vehicles, mostly all-electric vehicles, or you're violating the law. So that means a lot of the infrastructure is going to go in place first in those states. So in other parts of the country, in the Midwest and the South, the transition is going to be slower because that infrastructure is not going to grow as fast. Another reason we need hybrids and plug-in hybrids.
Is that another area where regulations are getting ahead of basically consumer behavior?
Right. Well, what's happening in California right now, it's very interesting. They've had a good steady increase in the penetration of electric vehicles in their market. They're now at around 20% of all new car sales are electric in California. It might be 7 or 8% nationwide. But the growth rate in California is starting to taper. And in the last quarter, Tesla's sales in the United States actually went down for the first time in several years. So it remains to be seen whether the state-level mandates are really feasible.
Well, I know a recent study from the Boston Consulting Group found that potential EV adopters say they want 3 things to happen before they'll consider switching from gas to EVs. Charging times under 20 minutes, a 350-mile plus driving range, and a sticker price under $50,000. Only one model of EV currently meets those criteria. So I'm, again, curious if these regulations are outpacing the reality of what might be achieved in the EV marketplace, because, again, the infrastructure isn't necessarily in place right now, and consumers say, hey, we need more before we're willing to make that change.
Well, there are lots of different consumers out there. If you have a very wealthy family, they have 3 cars, they can have 1 Tesla, and they can use a Tesla supercharging network. And then if they don't want to use their electric car on that day, they'll use one of their gasoline cars. But obviously, if we're going to try to get 100% of all vehicles to be all electric, we have to have middle-income people and lower middle-income people. They also have to be able to use these. If you only have 1 car and it's an all-electric vehicle, you're going to have difficulty sustaining the lifestyle that you've been accustomed to. And even your employment may be hard to sustain in that situation. Once again, going too fast doesn't necessarily help.
Right. Well, I know there are previous examples of regulations managing to change behavior, such as the use of seatbelts, which increased its use rate from 14% in 1983 to better than 90% in 2022, thanks to seatbelt laws. Stronger drunk driving laws have led to plummeting rates of drunk driving fatalities. But is it possible to regulate widespread adoption of EVs, since those regulations aim to change consumer choices rather than behaviors?
Well, technically speaking, as a lawyer, these regulations are on the manufacturer. They say to the manufacturer, if you want to do business in our state, you have to sell a certain percentage of all electric vehicles. And then they leave it to the manufacturers and the dealers to figure out how to sell enough vehicles to meet these regulations. It's not a surprise. The dealers are the ones who wrote President Biden and said, hey, wait a minute. We've got all these electric vehicles on our lots right now, and they're not selling very fast.
Yeah.
And they're saying it's not going to be that easy. So we'll see how this plays out. It may take a little longer than the regulators think.
And I know you've talked before on this podcast about how delivery trucks, buses, things that are shipping containers, that could play a much bigger role in terms of lowering fossil fuel use when you get those vehicles involved outside of consumers. Is that something that should be a bigger focus of these car manufacturers?
Yes, and that's a business that's well underway. When you have urban delivery vehicles, they deliver pizzas within prescribed areas and so forth and so on. The range issues are not as serious, and they can have regular recharging every night back at the home station. So you are already seeing a lot of penetration of electric technology into those kind of applications.
And for consumers, should they kind of look at it? I mean, range is always a big focus if they want to take a long trip. For most people, they're basically moving around town. As should a bigger focus from consumers be on the need for that range, or if you have two cars, one of them is an EV, can you kind of create a situation where you have a hybrid house with a gas-powered and an EV vehicle? Should consumers look at things from that point of view?
Well, we already have evidence that consumers, if they're wealthy enough, they are looking at it from that point of view. And they like the idea of having an electric car, and they also like the idea of having a gasoline-powered car or a hybrid of some form. So, but the problem is there are households that can only afford one vehicle.
Right.
Okay, and that's a much bigger challenge, particularly if they don't have a garage to charge at home their vehicle. So where are they going to charge this thing on a regular basis? If they try to use public charging stations, they realize after they use it for a couple weeks, they charge double the electricity price at these charging stations than they do at home.
Right.
So one of the big advantages of an electric vehicle is it's cheaper than gasoline to get your energy. It deteriorates with these public charging stations. So they're not going to be happy about that when they realize what the real reality of the situation is. So there's a lot of issues to work out yet for ordinary middle-class Americans who can't afford to have multiple cars. How is this transition going to happen?
Well, there seems to be these different hurdles that there's this big push for EVs, and yet do they create more emissions in the short term than gas-powered vehicles? Things like wear and tear on the roads. The idea of being able to replace that gasoline tax hasn't quite been smoothed out. Where is the sense of urgency, I guess, for those issues to be solved?
Well, the good news is that the electricity sector in the United States is getting cleaner. We're replacing coal with natural gas at a very rapid rate, and both wind and solar power increasing rapidly. So it turns out that from a carbon dioxide emissions, pollution related to climate change, from that perspective, electric vehicles are a much better deal in the United States today than they were 10 years ago. And in fact, there's more pollution related to climate change coming from the transportation sector than from the electric power sector. That was never true before. So this means the environmental case for these electric vehicles is good, and it's getting better. The real issues are the practical ones that you've raised in this conversation about how do we get consumers to make sure that they're comfortable, that they can hold their jobs and have a reasonable lifestyle. And it's not good enough to say to people, oh, well, most of the time you can use your electric vehicle. You have enough range.
Right.
Well, people like to buy a vehicle that over Memorial Day and July 4th and Labor Day and Christmas, they can drive 500 miles with kids, with a dog in there.
Sure.
And have a good time for their vacation. And the system isn't set up well enough to accommodate a family that uses their electric vehicle that way as well as in their daily commuting.
And you've mentioned wealthy families and that can afford these cars a lot. Is there a certain gap there? Because I know a lot of middle-class families, lower-income families, used cars are what they look at the most.
Right.
Has there just not been enough time that's passed to make enough of these available on the used car market to help bring those costs down?
Well, so far we don't have a robust a used car market as we would like to have. For example, most of the electric cars that are in the used car market right now, they're Teslas, because they're the ones that sold originally. And lots of people would love to have a Tesla. And what that does is it keeps the price of the used Teslas up.
Right.
So really, for the used car market, we don't yet have a good solution yet. So we're going to have a lot more success in the new car market, affordable electric cars in the new car market, before we're going to have a realistic opportunity for those used car purchasers.
Going back to the lack of a gasoline tax and how we take
Yeah.
care of our roads,
Yes.
what are some of the other options that are being looked at to kind of offset the loss of gasoline taxes when it comes to taking care of the roads?
Well, the most sensible idea would be to simply have a mileage tax, where you have a recording of how many miles each vehicle goes, and people either on a monthly basis, a quarterly basis, or a yearly basis, they pay a certain fee, 8 cents per mile or whatever it is, and that goes into the fund. Problem is, the politicians have realized voters don't trust them to pass a mileage tax. They think that what they're going to do is they're just going to add the mileage tax to the gasoline tax, and people are going to have to pay more of both taxes. Well, this is going to be very hard to get those passed. Oregon, the state of Oregon has come closest to actually adopting a mileage tax, and the politicians there have basically backed off, and they're still doing pilot projects and demonstration projects. The more popular idea right now is simply to add a special registration fee. When you register an electric vehicle, you have to pay an extra tax, and that money will go to the state for roads. And most states are now adopting those taxes.
With gasoline taxes, people usually don't even notice that's part of the equation when they're being charged a tax, whether when you register, whether it's quarterly, monthly, whatever it is. That's going to seem like an extra bill for people. There will have to be a change in mindset by consumers with that as well, won't there?
Right, and it's another example of how this transition process is not going to be rapid. It's going to take time to build the consensus, to do the things necessary to build out the whole system, the transportation system, so that it is functioning, it's sustainable, it's financially viable, and a lot of those issues haven't been fully worked out yet. But this is not uncommon to innovation.
Right.
Innovation is often a messy process, and it takes time.
If you were in charge of putting these regulations in place, what kind of timeline would you be looking at in terms of being able to make a complete shift or push these companies to be able to sell X number of new cars? Is there a different timeline you would be following?
Well, I don't know the exact numbers, but I do know, for example, the state of California says that you have to have 100% electric vehicles by 2035. But they'll allow 20% of those to be plug-in hybrids, but only if these plug-in hybrids have 50 miles of all-electric range. There aren't any plug-in hybrids that have 50 miles of all-electric range. They're usually 20 to 40 miles. So my thought is you have to give more flexibility for conventional hybrids and for plug-in hybrids within the regulatory framework. If you do that, you can have a pretty stringent regulation, and you can still get a lot of environmental benefits, but you have to allow more for the hybrids.
Well, this is an incredibly interesting subject to me, because it is a shift that is coming. There is no stopping it. It's going to come. It's just the issues and the hurdles and that have to be overcome are really interesting to me. And Professor Graham, I really appreciate your insight on this, and I hope you'll join us more, because I'm sure I'll have more questions as this thing goes forward.
This topic's not going away, Ken.
No. Well, thank you so much.
Take care.
Well, that's all the time we have today on O'Neill Speaks. O'Neill Speaks is the official podcast of the Paul H. O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs. All opinions and comments on O'Neill Speaks belong to the host and the guest of the O'Neill School and don't necessarily reflect those of the school itself. Music for O'Neill Speaks is by Manos Mars. Be sure to subscribe to O'Neill Speaks on Apple Podcasts or on your favorite podcatcher app so you don't miss an episode. We're out of time, but for now, and for the O'Neill School, I'm Ken Bykoff saying thanks for listening, everybody. Thank you.